You know, I just gave him that song early this morning, and he told me that he'd really never led it before, didn't know the song, but he did a great job with it. I appreciate it, and it is going to fit in well with this morning's lesson. It's good to see everybody this morning. We are going to continue our little series about the betrayal, the trial, the crucifixion, and the resurrection of Christ. Last week we talked about the things that were involved in the trial. We looked at the fact that Jesus was arrested there in Gethsemane. He was taken to Annas, who was the high priest by Jewish law, though by Roman law it was his son-in-law Caiaphas. He was taken to Caiaphas, and from there he was taken to Pilate. It is noteworthy that he went to Pilate after the Sanhedrin met at sunrise. It was illegal to have the trial they had there at night, which had transpired. And then from Pilate, he's taken over to Herod for a short period of time, then brought back to Pilate. And that's where we left off last week. He had been sent to Pilate, and Pilate, though his wife wanted him to do nothing with it, he was told by the people, "We want you to crucify him." And so the crucifixion of Christ. I have on the screen for us an outline, if you will, a map of what Jerusalem looked like at that time. There's a degree of speculation on a couple of things, but it gives us something to picture as we go through the events of this morning's lesson. What we note is there is the temple and the place where Herod the Great was. Remember, when he sent him over to Herod, it wasn't like he was sending him clear up to Galilee. Herod was in town, and he was sent to Herod. We also find that the area where Pilate was in charge, the palace there, is very close in proximity. And we find that most people think that the Golgotha was just outside what we know today as the gates of the city of Jerusalem. Now, there have been some who suggested they think they found someplace else that may have been Golgotha, the place of the skull. It doesn't matter to us. It is that he was, and what I want to present here is that he was, in fact, at a very short proximity to the building, the city of Jerusalem. He was in a very short proximity there as far as what was concerned. And so, by the way, one other thing to note is that there is now a Catholic church building on top of the area where they think Jesus was crucified, they think where Jesus was buried. They've got church buildings everywhere. Some could be fairly accurate. Who knows about the others? This is just to give you a general idea. So let's move on, and we're going to notice now, as we begin our study, that we're talking now about the idea of him being taken to Golgotha. As he's being taken to Golgotha, it is to be delivered up by Pilate to be crucified. And we talked about that to some degree last Sunday, and we've been studying about it in our study in John, especially in these last few weeks. And in some ways, there's a repetition, but for those who weren't able to be at the class, and even within the class, we're getting, I hope, a quicker timeline through it all, rather than the weeks it's been taking us to go through this study This way we're seeing it as it transpired relatively quickly. In fact, John, the 19th chapter, in verse 16 tells us, then he delivered him to them to be crucified, so they took Jesus and led him away. So when they led him away, they were in charge of doing what they wanted to do. What they wanted to do was mock him. They wanted to put the crown of thorns on his head. They wanted to beat him. They wanted to put a purple robe on him as if he truly were royalty. I don't know if you've thought about it before, but that robe went on a back that had been laid open by the beating. It was laid open on that flesh. Matthew tells us in Matthew's account in the 27th chapter, beginning at verse 29, and when they had twisted a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, and a reed in his right hand. And they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! Then they spat on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. Mark also gives the account. I've repeated this aspect. I mentioned it toward the end of last week. I've mentioned it in Bible classes. I've mentioned it a number of times throughout our time together, but I want to do it again today because of the many things that happened that day in the mocking of Jesus. For me personally, the idea of them spitting on him was one of the most grotesque things. Now, having his back laid open with that terrible beating was a horrific thing. But for the deity of God the Son to be mocked and called the King of the Jews, when in fact he is the King of the universe. It is by him the universe was created, and by him it is held together. And then these Roman soldiers came up and they just spit in his face, probably till their putrid spit was running down his face. And he took it. I will tell you that in my early years of preaching, as I told this story, I had to hold back tears. You might say, well, shame on you, Joe, for being able to tell it now without the tears. But I know within my heart there is that sense of tears for all the mocking that was taking place that day. So the soldiers did this. They clothed him. And then they, in the beating, did so in a way that it even was described as disfiguring him. I don't know if you've ever had the inclination to look at somebody who has been badly beaten beyond recognition. I had the unfortunate opportunity's a strange word, to see something like that when I was in the Navy. A Navy SEAL opened his parachute at 150 feet. Guess what? He died. And he was a mess. That's what they did to Jesus. They didn't beat him to death, but they beat him. Isaiah has told us in Isaiah 52, we usually think about other things that are talked about when Isaiah talks about Messiah. Just as many were astonished at you, so his vestige was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. Now, there may be some poetic sense here, but the point is, he was beaten severely. The NIV tells us that many who were appalled at him. It's possible that even some of the Roman soldiers may have been a little horrified with how far they had gone in the beating. The NIV goes on to say that his appearance was so disfigured, swollen, mangled, if you will. The NIV says it was marred beyond human likeness. And that's before he was crucified. Now he's going to Golgotha. Now he's leaving the soldiers to drag the cross to his execution. John relates there in this 17th verse of chapter 19, and he, bearing his cross, went out to a place called the place of a skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. And of course, we still have the little map up in the corner each time with the blue circle. It was right outside the city. He wasn't able to drag it very far, and they had to call somebody that was just standing there. Now, later we happen to know who his sons were, but really the New Testament and history doesn't tell us much about Simon of Cyrene. Now, as they led him away, they laid hold on a certain man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it after Jesus. Jesus was weakened by this beating, by the scourging. The cross was probably not a huge thing we think of. Most people, when they picture it, they think of maybe almost a 12 by 12, 12 inch by 12 inch, or 10 inch by 10 inch post with a cross beam on it that would have been extremely heavy. It was heavy enough to hold a body, but it was still heavier than Jesus could handle after all he had gone through. Cyrene is in an area that we would call Libya, along the Mediterranean coast. And like I said, we're told that he had sons, but again, Scripture tells us nothing about that. Now, when he's about to be crucified, he is offered wine and myrrh. Over in Matthew, we're told in verse 34 of 27, they gave him sour wine mingled with gall to drink. But when he had tasted it, he would not drink. It was, in fact, bitter herbs and considered an anesthetic. One little act of kindness was what they were willing to offer. Here, we're going to give you a sedative. We're going to give you a little Xanax. Basically, is what they were offering. And then we come to the crucifixion itself. When we think about the crucifixion and all that was involved in the crucifixion, we need to remember the story as it unfolds in our mind's eye. As he is laid on the cross, as the nails spikes are being driven through his hands. Just as a technicality, this was considered part of the hand. The nails were probably driven in this area to allow the makeup of the bones of the wrist to help hold it in place, and they probably tied them as well. But there was pressure there, and the spikes were driven in. He was laid on that cross with his back already ripped open with that beating. He was laid on that cross, and his feet then were overlapped in all probability, and another spike is driven in it. And they say that what they did was gave it a slight angle so that from time to time the one being crucified could force themselves up to get some breath and air. Because as you slumped during a crucifixion, your passageway became blocked and it was difficult to breathe. And of course, putting him up on the cross was a torturous event as they nailed him, then lifted him and dropped him into the hole. Now, some have suggested maybe it was just the crossbeam that he carried. You think it makes it any different that they nailed him to the crossbeams first and then maybe had a couple of ladders? And again, this cross wasn't 5 feet off the ground or 10 feet off the ground. It was very close to the ground. But they struggled to get that crossbeam up there, tearing at his flesh. That was the ugliness of the crucifixion. Can you imagine the soldiers as they realized with the two thieves, and we'll talk about them in just a moment, with the two thieves on each side, they probably were fighting and screaming, or they were rather sedated from the wine that they had been given, the gall that they'd been given as the anesthetic. In my mind, Jesus laid his hands over to be nailed and didn't fight it because he knew what he was going to do for you and for me. And so, he's crucified. Roman citizens weren't allowed to be crucified. It was that torturous. It was considered that wicked a punishment of death that they weren't going to put their citizens through it. They had other ways of dealing with them. Only the non-citizens, only non-Romans would be crucified. And so he was crucified. He was dropped into place. The probability is, and this isn't depicted in pictures, I've seen one or two that did, but the probability is they were crucified naked. They wanted them shamed as much as possible. He was crucified in front of the disciples, in the presence of his mother, the ladies who had ministered to him for 3 years. He hangs on that tree. He had difficulty breathing. All of his senses would have been under attack because he didn't take that sedative. And even those who took the sedative, my understanding is it wasn't like it was intended to put you into a twilight until you died. It was simply to calm you down while they were busy nailing you to the cross. So with every twitch of his body, he was feeling the nails. With every moment that went by, he was trying to breathe. He would have stood to get breath. Can you imagine the headache he had? I've never had migraines. My wife and others suffer sometimes from what's called blind headaches or migraines. Some of you just have flat out migraines. And my impression is it's just unbelievable. And there he is on the cross. Having had that thorny crown put on his head, trying to breathe, the agony that was involved, I would have thought it to be unbearable. And now the crucifixion goes from 9 in the morning until 12, as we're going to talk about it. We find first they begin to cast lots for his garments. Mark tells us in the 15th chapter in verse 24, and when they crucified him, they divided his garments, casting lots for them to determine that every man should take, or what every man should take. We're not going to go to Psalm 22 right now. But when you read Psalm 22 and then read all that was involved in the crucifixion, if you don't see the crucifixion in Psalm 22, I don't understand you. And I've met some brethren that in so many ways I have a lot of respect for, that don't see the crucifixion in Psalm 22. And then he's confronted with the two robbers, one on each side. And of course, being robbers, they're of men of high moral character. And they begin to mock and belittle him. They ridicule him because he's going through the same thing they're going through, although they may have looked and said, wow, we didn't get that kind of beating. Well, maybe they did to some extent, but not, as Isaiah said, marred beyond the appearance of a man. These robbers had the nerve to mock and belittle the Son of God. Luke tells us in the 23rd chapter, verse 33, and when they had come to the place called Calvary, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on the right hand and the other on the left. And in the course of the mocking and the ridicule, we find that finally one of the robbers stops it. And we're going to look at what he says and Jesus' response. But in the meantime, what does Jesus do with regard to what was happening to him? He says, Father, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing. That's not to the two thieves mocking. That's to the Jewish leadership that demanded his crucifixion. That's for the people who never came down to the crucifixion but were willing to yell, crucify him, crucify him. That's for the Roman soldiers that probably participated in the severe beating and certainly were observing his horrific death on the cross. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And then they divided their garments. Did God forgive them? Scripture tells us God only forgives those who repent. Then when did God answer Jesus' prayer? That's not a difficult answer to find. It's found in Acts, the 2nd chapter. On the day of Pentecost, when people repented after Peter and the other apostles had accused them of crucifying the Messiah. Peter speaking specifically to the people of Judea, and were baptized into Christ. The inscription was put up. You talk about something that aggravated the leaders of the Jewish people. The various gospel accounts tells us, but we'll use Matthew 27:37. And they put up over his head the accusation written against him, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." They put it in the 3 languages so that everybody would know what was going on. They put it in the Hebrew, they put it in the Greek, they put it in the Latin. They wanted the people to know what the charge was. And you'll recall that the high priest, the chief priest, and others were furious. No. Right? He says he's King of the Jews. Pilate finally got a little bit of backbone and said, "I have written what I have written." And it stayed up there for all to see. Any passers-by. Whoa. The Romans are crucifying the King of the Jews. But that didn't stop the people that were there. They mocked him. Matthew tells us in 27:42, they said, "He saved others, save himself. But he cannot save. But he's King of Israel. If he is King of Israel, let him now come down from the cross, and we will believe him." I don't think they would have. Oh, maybe some would have. But this is part of the mocking that took place. Hey, Jesus, step off the cross. Hey, you're the Christ? Step off the cross. Oh, you raised Lazarus. You raised others. You healed people on the Sabbath. You didn't mind showing that off. Come on. Get off the cross. Hey, chicken, get off the cross. What's the matter? Can't handle the cross? They taunted him. They belittled him. They did all they could to humiliate him. Psalm 22. Psalm 22. All those who see me ridicule me. They shoot out the lip. They shake the head, saying, "He trusted in the Lord. Let him rescue him. Let him deliver him. Since he delights in him." Is that not what was taking place as Jesus hung on the cross? Peter makes this point for us to consider in 1 Peter, the 2nd chapter, beginning at 21. "For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that we should follow his steps, who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth, who when he was reviled," and that happened a number of times through his ministry, but certainly at the crucifixion, "did not revile in return. When he suffered, He did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously. Now, one of the thieves changes their mind. In Matthew's account, 27 verse 44, even the robbers who were crucified with him, they reviled him with the same thing. So they joined in the mockery they were hearing. But Luke tells us things changed. Then one of the criminals, Luke 23, then one of the criminals who was hanged blasphemed him, saying, "If you are the Christ, save yourself and us." But the other answering rebuked him, saying, Do you not even fear God, seeing that you were under the same condemnation? You too are dying? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds. They were repeat offenders, apparently. But this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said to Jesus, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said to him, Assuredly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. We find that as the end draws near, in John 19, beginning at 25, now there stood at the cross of Jesus his mother, his sisters, his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus therefore saw his mother, the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, Woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, Behold your mother. And from that hour the disciple took her to his home. This was one of the greatest evidences that Jesus is the Son of God. There's not a woman here who gave birth to a child who would allow them to be so tortured and put to death because of a lie. She knew the father. She knew it wasn't Joseph. She knew it wasn't someone else in the neighborhood. She could have spoken at any time and said, My son's got this problem. I'll tell you who the father was. It really was Joseph. We fooled around before we got married. It was a gentleman that I knew. I had been mistreated, and Joseph was kind enough to take care of me anyhow. So don't pay attention to this thing about Jesus and his father. I'll tell you who his father was. She kept her mouth shut. Actually, there are probably a lot of women who would have lied to save their son from such a death. She did not. She sat quietly. She stood quietly because she knew he was the Son of God. So he had turned to his mother, and John takes care of her from then on. There are three groups of people spoken of being at the cross: the soldiers, the Jewish mockers, we might say Jewish people, even those who weren't mocking, but Jewish mockers, and then those who loved him. The women who had been part of the entourage, some of the disciples, apostles. And now we move to 12 o'clock till 3 o'clock. Darkness covers the land. Mark 15 tells us, now when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. It's at that point that the Lord cries out. Mark tells us in 15 and verse 34, at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. Translated, my God, why have you forsaken me? I believe that's a misunderstood passage even by brethren, even by fellow Christians. There's a doctrine out there, and I don't know if any of you hold to this. There's a doctrine out there that Jesus at that point became the sinner for mankind. I know some Christians who hold that view. He took on the sins of mankind, but he was always God. Therefore, it was impossible for him to ever be a sinner. Even as Paul talks about it to the Corinthians, he's referencing it symbolically, not that Jesus became a sinner. The idea is given by many denominations and even among some brethren. Why? Forsaking it. God had to turn his back on Jesus. The scriptures never tell us God turned his back on his son. He was calling to mind to the people that were crucifying him, remember Psalm 22. Now, frankly, I'm not sure what they called that psalm. But they knew. Especially those who were scribes and Pharisees, also known as hypocrites. Scribes and Pharisees knew most of those psalms by heart, and especially that one. So when they heard him say, why hast thou forsaken me? They're not thinking, oh, God's done with him. I believe they're thinking about the dividing of his clothes, us mocking him, all the things that are talked about there in Psalm 22. The defeat that appears to be taking place, but Psalm 22 ends in victory. The victory of Christ. He is then offered vinegar. Mark's account. Then someone ran and filled it because he said, I thirst. Then someone ran and filled a sponge full of sour wine, put it on a reed and offered it to him to drink, saying, let him alone. Let's see if Elijah will come and take him down. They wanted to keep torturing at him because they'd misunderstood, some of them, or they willingly weren't wanting to attribute it to Psalm 22. Let's see if Eli comes. And then Jesus says, it is finished. That's John's account. We're going to very quickly read the four Gospels, because the four Gospels all mention it. Mark says, he breathed with a loud voice, he breathed his last. Matthew says, with a loud voice, yielded up his spirit. Luke says, cried out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Having said this, he breathed his last. And then, of course, John, that we're familiar with, it is finished. And bowing his head, he gave up the spirit. The Lord willing, next week we're going to talk about what transpires at his death. But the events around the death are seen clearly in the veil being torn because of the earthquake that arises. And the veil was torn from the top down, and it's 40 feet high or better. The earthquake comes and the rocks split open. Matthew tells us the graves were opened and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised and came out of the graves after his resurrection. They went into the holy city and appeared to many. Now, let's put our minds around what happened here. I think what the text seems to be telling us overall is sepulchres opened up in the earthquake. Tombs opened. But those bodies didn't come out until after Jesus arose on the first day of the week, and they were the locals. Those who were believers in Jesus, that other believers in Jesus alive would recognize. I think that's what transpired. I don't think it was a Mount of Transfiguration situation in which all of a sudden the people were seeing Elijah and Moses and whomever, but rather some dead saints dying recently, and then when Jesus arises, they too came out of their sepulchres. It is at that point that the centurion says there in Matthew's account, the centurion who was with him, who was guarding Jesus, saw the earthquake and the things that had happened. They feared greatly, saying, "Truly, this was the Son of God." They were overwhelmed to see rocks splitting, the earth shaking, darkness coming over the city. And at least one said, "This is the Son of God." Because he was dead and the Jews wanted the bodies gone over this high holy day of Passover weekend, they had the bones broken so that they could no longer keep themselves up and breathe and last for days. They broke the thieves' bones, legs, and once they slumped down, their passageway was stopped and they suffocated. Jesus was dead. Why? He had finished his work and he gave up the ghost. He gave up his spirit. Well, let's make sure he's dead. And so his side was pierced. John tells us that when his side was pierced, immediately blood and water came out. And after that, the crowd dispersed. They went their way. Some went beating their chests. And there's two ways of looking at it. One, in the sense of beating their chest. We've put him to death. Most writers, scholars say that that probably wasn't it. That it was a mournful striking of the chest for what they had witnessed. And so it was done. The crucifixion, Christ died. The crucifixion happened, all of this happened because of and for you and me. What are you going to do about it? If you're outside of Christ, what are you going to do about it? If you're in Christ and need the prayers of the congregation, we'd love to pray with you and for you. But if you have a need to respond, we invite you to have a seat here at the front as we stand and sing the song of encouragement.